Let's talk a little bit about organizing your survey and the construction of your survey from the different types of questions that you're going to ask and expect to be answered to what happens right before you're ready to go live. So when you set up your survey, it's more than just giving your respondents a list of questions to answer. It's always good form to start, first of all, with an informed consent page. So no matter what of the survey tools we'll talk about later that you decide to use, all of them give you the option to include just some standalone text. And so that text box that they first see should be your informed consent. If you go through full IRB a little bit later or through another institution, then you will actually give respondents the ability to say yes or no to the survey. But you, for purposes of this class, will assume that if they have clicked on the survey and they read the information you give them about consent, that they're probably going to consent to do the survey. So you always start with an informed consent so that participants know a few basic things like what types of questions you're going to ask and how long the survey is going to take and who they can talk to if they have questions or are disturbed by the survey questions that you get. It's also good to have an introductory paragraph with very specific directions. You might assume that people would know you just answer the questions. And while on one level that's true, it's also really disorienting to just jump into a list of questions as a respondent. So always make sure you've got a short introductory paragraph that says, something like, thank you for choosing to take my survey. This survey has X number of questions. It should take you X amount of time. And please answer honestly, or select the one answer for each question, or select multiple answers. Give them some instructions about how you've set up your questions so that the respondents know exactly what they are expected to do. And then, of course, always end with a thank you or some sort of closing. Like, it's kind of disorienting to take a survey that just abruptly ends. It's always good to confirm that the respondents have met the requirements, have reached the end of the survey, and just one last sign off. Thank you, you're finished. We appreciate you. Close your browser. Depending on the type of questions you ask, you might also consider including information that might be helpful to people if they are taking questions or answering questions that might be disturbing in some way, or that might lead them to think they need more additional resources. So I'll give you an example. I've got a colleague, Rosalie, who was a good friend of mine at Kentucky. And she's a communication professor now too, and she studies suicide prevention. So her whole research agenda is around how can we use communication skills to try to prevent suicides from happening, and how do we intervene when we know someone's suicidal. So super important research. She does a lot of survey research along with that. And at the end of every survey that she gives, she always makes sure to include a number to the suicide prevention hotline so that anybody who took the survey and realized maybe they had issues or had suicidal thoughts, or just know someone who is suicidal, they've got a resource that they can give that information away and use it if they need it. So it is important to think about the gravity of your questions and what you're asking people. Any survey you've got dealing with mental health issues, a lot of you in this class are dealing with mental health issues this semester, you might want to consider including a talk line number or a website to KSU counseling, something to give people just another resource if they finish your survey and they realize, wow, this brings up a lot of issues for me. Maybe I need to go get some additional help. One thing to help make sure you've covered all of this is to pre-test and proofread your survey very carefully. This is always the last step I recommend before you go live. Have someone else in the class take the survey for you and ask them to give you feedback. So I strongly recommend like a partner system for this. Find a buddy in the class on the GroupMe, or maybe some of you already know somebody else who's in the class, and ask that person to take the survey for you and give you any feedback. You would be surprised what sort of errors come up once somebody else looks at your survey. Little things that you just didn't notice were wrong. And I'm not really talking about typos or grammatical errors. I mean, there can be issues with the way that your questions were worded or the way the survey was constructed. So that's a really good chance for us to jump into talking about what types of questions you might answer. So there are two broad types of questions, and for your survey, I want you to focus on the closed-ended rather than the open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are those that you use when you want to directly quote people or you want people to use their own words. Honestly, they're better for when you want qualitative data. Use open-ended questions in the interviews and the focus groups, not so much for the surveys. For these surveys, I want you to focus on the quantitative aspect. expect. So go for the closed-ended questions. These are questions you use when you have an agreement on what the responses would be. If it's closed-ended, it means that you as a researcher give your participants options for what they can choose. So these are your multiple choice questions, your yes or no questions, and we'll talk about all kinds of different questions a little bit later in this video. When you write these closed-ended questions, there's a couple things you want to keep in mind from the beginning. First of all, you want to make sure that your responses are exhaustive, which means that you give a complete list of options. So let's say that you are studying binge watching behaviors in college students, and one of the questions you ask is, which of these platforms do you use to binge watch? Well, you don't just want to include a list that has Netflix and Hulu, because there's so many other platforms people could use to binge watch. You want to make sure you include Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime. I don't know, are there others? I don't really binge watch TV. It's terrible. But you know what all the platforms are. So giving your pretest, giving your survey as a pretest would be crucial for me on this question, because I want somebody to tell me what platforms have I ignored, what have I left off, how else could people binge watch content. So exhaustive means you give people a complete total list of all the possible responses they could choose. You also should make sure that your question responses are mutually exclusive, meaning one answer does not automatically exclude the other one. So I'll give you another example. A good example of a survey question that is not mutually exclusive would be if you are asking people, how old are you? And you've got answers 1, 2, 3, or 4. Number 1 is 18 to 25. Number 2 is 25 to 32. Number 3 is 32 to 39. Number 4 is 40 to 47. Let's say that I am 25 years old. Do I choose response 1 or 2? Technically, I could choose either one because they're both valid in those categories, but that's going to skew your data because you're going to have some 25-year-olds who choose 1, some who choose 2, and you're not really getting an accurate count of all the 25-year-olds in your study. So this is a really good example of how an answer is not mutually exclusive. To fix this, easy fix, you just make sure that each category stands alone. So the first one might be 18 to 25, the second one might be 26 to 32, the third one might be 33 to 39. So easy to fix, but it is something important to think about. Another option you have for closed-ended questions would be something called a Likert type question. These are really popular among my students. They are those responses where you choose sort of on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, you have an odd number of responses with polar opposites. So like agree to disagree, prefer, do not prefer, and then you have a neutral middle. If you want to get at what somebody is feeling or how happy they are with something, or you want to look for comparisons, these are excellent questions. And they give you so much better data than just an A, B, C, or D multiple choice you could come up with on your own. Your textbook has a lot of super helpful charts for these Likert type questions. So definitely check out the textbook readings for this week because there's all kinds of helpful charts to help you see how Likert type questions can really work. The last type I'm going to cover is called a semantic differential. And this is a complicated term for a scale that has bipolar adjectives. So like if you're studying personality, if you're studying mental traits, those kind of things, a semantic differential can be good. Or if you just want to study perceptions, especially like an advertising campaign, and you want to know how people feel whenever they see the advertisement, then you want to give them 2 sets of polar opposite adjectives. So like, was this work organized or unorganized? Did you feel warm and fuzzy or really cold towards this? Would you say this is modern or old-fashioned? So this is an example of that semantic differential scale, and it's a lot like a Likert scale. In fact, in some of the quiz survey makers, you will set up these type of questions like a Likert scale, but it just uses polar opposite adjectives instead of others. All right, that's all I've got for the way you construct a survey. It's a lot to digest, and I went over it really quickly. So just make sure you're doing your textbook readings, and I expect to see lots of different types of questions in your surveys that you submit. Can't wait to see what kind of creative questions you come up with.